For days now, Hong Kong has witnessed ugly clashes in several parts. Protesters and police personnel have been facing off. Today marked the first time the protesters stormed the legislature building, the heart of the government of Hong Kong. These are the live visuals that we're getting to you. A sea of yellow helmets took over as tens of thousands clogged the streets surrounding the legislative building. Protesters have spray-painted messages on the walls, tearing down posters, smashing windows as they made their way inside the complex. The escalation in temper is also coming on the anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. 22 years ago today, on the 1st of July 1997, Hong Kong was returned to China by the British. Protesters in Hong Kong have taken over the legislative chamber. The Hong Kong government has demanded that the protesters currently who have been storming their way inside the Legislative Council must, quote-unquote, stop at once. Those have been the statements that have been issued by the authorities there. Protesters have been clashing with the police. Police, in turn, responding with pepper spray and firing rubber bullets in several parts. The series of protests find themselves targeting a controversial bill. The extradition bill would allow extradition to mainland China. Protesters fear that the law would allow Beijing to seize anyone it likes and whisk them off to mainland China. This latest round of protests sparked by a flag-raising ceremony that marked the city's handover from Great Britain to China 22 years ago. Early in the morning, large groups of protesters rallied outside the Hong Kong Convention Centre where the ceremony was taking place. Police used pepper spray and batons against the anti-government protesters who had seized the highways.
Yeah, exactly. I do think you're, absolutely agree with you. Okay, I'll put the phone down. I'm sitting on the beeper line basically, so I can hand the phone to Matt if his signal cuts out. Okay, I'll put it back into Lily. Thank you for this, Lily.
And joining us on the broadcast at this point is Andrew KP Leung. Thanks very much, Andrew, for speaking with us as always. Give our viewers a better sense of what we are witnessing on our screens. These have been violent protests that have only escalated, especially since today marks the 22nd anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. Is that the reason why we are seeing an escalation in tempers? The protests had subsided for a few days, and now the demonstrators are once again demanding that the extradition bill should be completely scrapped.
Well, of course, this is the climax of all the protests, huge protests during the past couple of weeks, venting the public's anger and resistance to this very controversial extradition bill, which has been on the cards for quite some months. And then the government has done a very, very poor job explaining the reason for the bill, and it's making short strips of the kind of consultation, narrowing down to a couple of weeks before trying to force it through the Legislative Council. This, of course, sparked a great deal of anger and frustration, both in the anti-government legislative camp and also the public at large, because the perception has been that one country, two systems during all these decades have been tilting towards the one country rather than protecting the characteristics of the two systems. And then this is really the last straw on the camel's back. But then if you look at the protesters, a large number of them are peaceful, orderly students, housewives, people from all walks of life. But at the forefront, they are the hooligans, and then really they may be using lethal weapons, makeshift weapons, some sharp metal steel rods, and throwing bricks, so at the police. And now they're storming inside the Legislative Council, breaking a lot of stuff, defacing the album. Obviously, the front line cannot be defined as ordinary protesters.
Right, Andrew, you've been witnessing these protests for the last 3 weeks. What's your impression and assessment of the way Carrie Lam has handled this entire period, and the protesters clearly wanted to step down. They're not convinced with a mere suspension of the bill. They want it to be completely scrapped. Do you see the Hong Kong authorities giving in to that demand?
Well, if you look at the bill itself, I mean, Carrie Lam has already made it quite clear that the whole thing has been suspended, all the work has stopped, and there is no chance of it even surviving before the end of the current legislative session in next summer. And then, of course, the pro-government legislative camp, who are supposed to support it, is now in no position to cast their votes in support at all, because the elections are coming up, and then with the massive protests, they will lose tremendously in the coming elections. So the bill is dead in the water. A suspension is really tantamount to scrapping it altogether. And then, of course, there are so many other issues facing the Hong Kong government, and Carrie has made it quite clear that she would concentrate on livelihood issues. She would listen more to the people. But of course, with this kind of anger, they are in no mood to listen. And also the fear amongst the Hong Kong government as well as Beijing is that there are forces behind this movement trying to push it to the extreme so as to provoke the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government to take drastic measures. For example, even sending the PLA, in which case the whole one country, two system would be ruined. And so I think that both Beijing and Hong Kong are alive to this kind of risks, and that's why they seem to be held back. And now, by allowing this mob to show that the true face of the violence for all to see, and then the whole a previous accusation against the police excessive use of force and now beginning to be debunked, as it were. At least, in what's happening in the Legislative Council tonight.
All right, so that's a large sense of what the protesters have been demanding and where the Hong Kong authorities stand at this point. Andrew, appreciate very much joining us on the broadcast as we continue to track the latest coming in from Hong Kong. Those have been scenes of violent clashes that have been witnessed over the last few hours. There's an escalation in tempers on ground, especially because today marks 22 years since Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule.